Dr. Moore, just a very few further questions. This morning, I asked you, and the Chair asked you about whether there might be a role for the department in offering advice, guidance or information on an emerging clinical picture where you might have, for example, a new virus. And you observed that the department generally doesn't have any more knowledge than the field, by which I think you meant the medical field. I just explored 2 points with you arising out of that. Could that have been remedied by ensuring that medical civil servants in the department were appropriately specialised to deal with the policy areas they were tasked with, and if not, by seeking advice and input from specialist doctors?
Yes. I don't think they could ever have been expected to themselves have the expertise of experts in the field who were dedicating their whole lives to identifying a particular virus, for example. So the only option really is for them to have good contacts with the outside. And if with HIV, we can say that the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS actually did provide that expertise, and that expertise informed the civil service doctors. And it was through the advice of the Expert Advisory Group, filtered by the departmental doctors, that guidance on how to approach the HIV virus did indeed go out to the community with the measures that the government announced, Norman Fowler's leaflet, and so on and so forth. So I think it actually happens.
And then the second point emerging out of this issue, if we take Hemophilia Care as an example, haemophilia clinicians are experts in haemophilia, but they're not experts in virology and they're not experts in hepatology. So might not that be precisely the kind of circumstance in which there's a role for the Chief Medical Officer or the department more generally to gather that wider clinical picture and ensure that it's made public so that those who are then taking decisions in their more narrow field are better informed?
Well, I think that again, in relation to HIV, refers back to the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS, because I think there were haemophilia doctors present as members of EAGA, so they would have been as well informed as they could possibly be at that time. Yes,
I mean, the Expert Advisory Group on AIDS, I think, met for the first time in January 1985, as I recall. So
did it? Oh,
prior to that, arguably there may have been a lacuna. In any event, I'll move to the next question. You've told us how, during your time at HS1A, which was this period 86 to the end of 88, the focus was very much on HIV as the threat. However, first of all, is this right? It's clear, just from the limited materials we've looked at today, that the department was aware of the risks of transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis, and that could give rise to chronic liver disease. Would you accept that?
I accept that, yes.
And so, as a matter of general principle, because you may well not know everything the department was doing during this time, would you accept as a matter of principle, given that knowledge, the department should have been examining, other witnesses may tell us they were, should have been examining whether steps could be taken to reduce transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis or to address the consequences of it? So in other words, it's not really good enough to say, well, our focus was on HIV when there's another threat as well.
I understand. I suppose the blood products laboratory was sufficiently aware of the issue to be working on a heat treatment that would inactivate non-A, non-B. Before the advent of AIDS, they were doing this in the early 80s or late 70s. And in fact, if it hadn't been for that work, preliminary intended to to kill non-A non-B, we wouldn't have had probably a heat treatment in such a timely way to use for HIV. And of course the department knew what the blood products laboratory was doing, so there was an awareness, and that one could say that that was an action to address the awareness. And it's difficult to know at a time when the virus hadn't been identified, and certainly looking at some of the papers from the time, the amount of transmission through blood transfusion in the UK didn't seem to be fully identified. It's hard to know what else could have been done, but I do understand the question.
You told us earlier about the importance of clinical freedom as it were, a cornerstone of Department of Health policy. What, if any, role, at least as far as HS1A was concerned, was there for the rights of patients to be fully informed about treatment choices and about the risks or consequences of treatment?
Well, the other mantra sitting alongside clinical freedom is the patient-doctor relationship, and that was something that again was held as something that had to be observed. So in terms of what a doctor told a patient about his or her treatment, that was a matter for the clinician. So in terms of Hemophilia Care, I mean, there's evidence from Hemophilia Reference Centre meetings that they were discussing issues around factor VIII, but what they told their patients seems to have been very much up to them. As far as I can read, I didn't have involvement in this. I'm only gleaning this from the papers. But whether the department would ever have thought it had a role in order to say to Dr. X, you must tell your patients this, I doubt whether the department would have thought it could intervene. It would have said that was the doctor-patient relationship, and like the clinical freedom, it didn't have a role.
So if we leave aside the department more broadly and talk about your work at HS1A, 86 to 88, or indeed your knowledge of what went beforehand in terms of the mantras or cornerstones of policy making, is it right then to understand from your answer that the right of patients to be fully informed didn't play any part in HS1A's work? Because
that's correct, it didn't.
Should it have done?
It wouldn't have been an initiative that could have come from HS1A. It would have come probably from Med-SEB, I suspect, rather than HS1A. I don't feel it's something, you're asking me with hindsight, is it something I overlooked? I don't think it is. I don't think it would have been within my remit.
If we then broaden it out a little more from HS1A, which I appreciate is one team within a multiplicity of teams, is that right of patients to be fully informed something which should at least have been on the radar of the department more generally and the chief medical officer more generally? In your view, as a principal in a policy team?
I wouldn't wish to criticise the chief medical officer at the time. I think the rights of patients is something that has come on the agenda more recently. I think it certainly, when I was in the department after I'd left blood, there were initiatives which actually put the patient more centrally than I believe it was in those days. I mean, it's certainly something that people have really close to the top of the list these days, but I don't think it was then. But I say that may just have been, I was in an isolated part of the department and it didn't cross my desk.
I asked you this afternoon about the issue of funding for the costs of the HCV testing. Is it right to understand your evidence as being that you don't think that regional transfusion centres wouldn't have had a problem getting funding from their regional health authorities?
I think they might have done, but it didn't really arise because, by then, the regional health authorities were expecting them to get the money from selling the products. So at that time, their options were a lump sum from the department from central funds, or to put some money onto the cost of the products and retrieve it from the hospitals, which is what they did.
I'd asked you about who was involved, who was consulted in discussions about the AIDS donor leaflet, and you mentioned as one of the organisations that would be consulted was the CBLA, for it to give a view on whether changing medical selection criteria, donor selection criteria, had implications for the plasma supply. Do you recall whether the CBLA ever did raise such concerns about any specific donor exclusion criteria?
Not as I recall. I think it was more a courtesy to show them it.
This then is a hypothetical question, but I've been asked to ask it in any event. If the CBLA had raised such a concern, would that have operated as a veto, or would that have just been an objection to weigh into the decision-making process?
Oh, it would have been a collegiate decision. If they had really valid grounds for saying it was wrong, it would have been considered. It would have gone back round the loop to see whether we could accommodate whatever their objection happened to be. It wouldn't have been a veto.
Then, last two questions. Record keeping, you made reference to the information you'd found since producing your witness statement. I'm asked to ask this. Do you know why 15 years was chosen?
No, when I saw it, I wondered, because normally it's a period for the youngest person to become an adult, isn't it? But I don't know why 15 years.
And then the last matter just goes back to a question I asked you this morning. When we were talking about the department's general line to take on compensation and its application to the cohort of people with haemophilia infected with HIV, the phrase that's in the general line is, we don't compensate for unavoidable adverse effects which may arise from some medical procedures. And you may recall, Dr. Moore, I asked you whether during your time in the Department of Health, so again, I'm really only talking about the period 86 to 88, unless you've got knowledge of anything before that, I asked you whether there was any investigation, inquiry or analysis internally within the department as to whether there'd been culpability or fault on anyone's part. And I'm not sure that you answered that directly. I don't mean that pejoratively, but I've been asked to put it to you again, or ask you again. In deciding whether, or in deciding that the general compensation line to take would be applied to the haemophilia cohort, did the Department of Health, to your knowledge, actually investigate whether there had been culpability or fault?
No.
Thank you.
It's really a two-step question, isn't it? Because the first question is, was it reasonable to think that the consequence that happened, that was so disturbing, could have been avoided? In other words, was it avoidable? Second question, should it have been avoided? There are two separate questions as I see it, logically. Was the first question, was it avoidable, ever looked at?
Not as far as I know, and certainly not in any formal way. At the time, I think we took the view that what had happened was something that was it's something that just happened. It was beyond our control, and that everybody did their best to mitigate the effects of the virus as they became apparent. So that was the view, and I don't think there was any formal inquiry to decide whether that was a proper view or not. And it follows from that no one could be blamed for it.
Exactly. Yeah. So the prior question really is the question which you would say, would you, of the, well, what would you say of the comment, if it were made, that it is quite surprising that the department, looking back, didn't say, well, could it have been avoided? What lessons can we learn?
It doesn't surprise me from the middle of it that it wasn't done. Could it have been done at a later date, and would it with some profit have been done at a later date? Quite possibly, but I don't think at the time it was a consideration.
Was it your feeling when you were later involved, National Directorate, that the Blood Service took a rather different approach because it had learnt lessons from what happened in the early 80s?
I think my understanding was that the Blood Transfusion Service wouldn't have considered itself culpable in any way for anything in terms of the steps it took to mitigate the risk of HIV. That everything they did was in a timely manner, and indeed our understanding at the time was that not many people had been infected with HIV through blood transfusion. Where I think the department might have wanted to look back was in the treatment of haemophiliacs with factor VIII, where there did seem to be a disparity of approach between transfusion centre directors that was possibly more unclear than the way in which the transfusion service behaved with transfusions.
Thank you.
So those are the questions I was proposing to ask Dr. Moore.
Well, there was only one other question I was going to ask. The questions I've just asked just arose out of the last interchange with Council. And it was this: you were asked this morning about the fact that England and Wales had 8Y before Scotland developed its 8Z. And there was a period of time when the Scottish product, albeit that it was safeguarding those who received it against the risk of HIV, so far as is known, did not protect them against the risk of contracting hepatitis, whereas 8Y did. And when Council said, would there have been any objection to some suppliers going to Scotland, had you known of them, if it had been a decision for the Directorate, as it were, if it had existed at the time, you would have said no, it wouldn't have been a problem. But when it happened, plainly, it was a rather different picture around the country. The Directorate wasn't yet in post. And you said it would have been a decision for the Haemophilia Regional Centre Directors. Why should it have been a decision for them?
I don't think I made a mistake if I said that. I didn't think it would be their decision. I think they would have been consulted, because we would have asked them about what they thought the availability of supply was, and we would have needed a picture of their requirement before we suggested that we gave some of it away. I think we would have wanted a complete picture to be fair to everybody. It certainly wouldn't have been their decision, but they would have been input to how that decision was made.
I see. So their regional needs, as it were, would have trumped the needs of other regions, or for that matter, Scotland.
Yeah, I mean, each region seemed to have a different requirement. There were regions where there were far more haemophiliacs than in other regions, the schools, for example. So I think we would have needed to get a bigger picture, quite frankly, before we started distributing it to Scotland. I'm not aware that the issue ever came up. I'm not aware that we ever were asked or considered, no, we shouldn't do this, but maybe my recollection is wrong.
I mean, suppose the position had been the other way around. Suppose Scotland had developed 8Y and England hadn't for some 18 months after that. Would you have expected national government to, UK national government, to have done something about remedying that position?
I would have thought so. I would have thought it would be something, well, either way round. I would have thought that I'm honestly not aware of knowing that Scotland were in that position at the time. I'm sure maybe there's a minute that shows that I was at a meeting where it was raised, but I can't at this distance be sure of that. It would have been very difficult to justify any other than some sort of equal supply across the nations to penalise one nation rather than another would have been difficult. But I mean, perhaps we were hoping that PFL could get the technology from BPL and start fractionating their own 8Y, because I know there was an exchange of technologies at one time. But I really don't know the dates of this problem.
Yes, well, thank you very much for that. That's all that I have to ask.
Dr. Moore, that's it then in terms of questions. Was there anything further you wanted to add?
I don't think so. I mean, I just would like to say that, to the best of my knowledge, the colleagues that I worked with at the time were doing their best. And I absolutely recognise that it's your job to determine whether that best was good enough, whether we could have done more, whether we could have done it more quickly, or in a different way. And I look forward to hearing the results of the inquiry. And if any blame is attached to me, then I'm obviously prepared to take it. And in fact, apologise if that seems to be due when you publish your findings.
Thank you.
Well, for the moment, let me thank you. Thank you for coming, first of all. Secondly, for giving us the benefit of your evidence, which, despite it being some time ago, and despite the very many different things you've done in your working lifetime, you have an amazing memory. Some of your descriptions, I think, will stick with me for a long time, not least your description of the meeting with the other Moores, John Moore, when the meeting effectively changed his mind, and how the Haemophilia Society at that meeting secured the arrangement which was then reached. And I'd like to thank you for putting a lot of the decisions and materials in context. You've explained quite a lot of the reasoning. You've been asked a lot, I know, about comments which you might have about the general philosophy of things like clinical freedom, which ultimately will be, for me, it's always tempting, but it really, I suppose, wasn't really your department, because you were there doing what you've told us you were doing. But it's been very useful to us to have your evidence.
Thank you, sir.
So that's obviously it for today, and then we have Dr. Gillen tomorrow.
Yes, we do.
Sorry.
At 10 o'clock.
Just checking. Yes, thank you.
And he's remote, is he?
Yes.
Yes. So we have Dr. Gillen remotely tomorrow.